So it's my turn for 12 days of making, and I wanted to show you guys a project I just made for my boys that I had a really good time making this project, and it was a pattern that was already a really great pattern that I just did some tweaking to make it work for what I wanted it to work for. So this is one of Karen's 250 patterns. You'll notice it's called the Kelly bag. Do you guys know Kelly from Oh So Personal? She needed a drawstring bag, so Karen was like, oh, I can make that. So she wrote the pattern up. I also needed a drawstring bag, but I needed mine to hold dice. So what I did was I took the Kelly bag pattern, which is meant to be just a sort of pouch bag that you can put your zipper feet in, or your sewing machine feet, or your jewelry, or if you want to go on vacation, you want to put tiddly bits in this sort of drawstring bag. I was also in the process at the same time of writing a pattern for my Dungeons and Dragons fabric, and I needed a dice bag. So I got with my boys, who are both D&D players, and we came up with this version of Karen's Kelly bag. What it is, the size is the same as what's in the pattern, but what I did was I added this little extra bit in the middle so that you could put, I made it with 8 little pockets. You can make the pockets smaller if your dice are bigger, or if you want to use it for other things, you can make more pockets. I made 8 pockets. This was my prototype. And when we made the prototype, the boys looked at it and they both said, well, if it was a little bit higher, you could put your whole set of dice in here. So we're going to make this version a little bit higher. There's not going to be as much space here. The other thing that I did to change the pattern was, in the pattern, this middle center here, which is the stabilizing bottom of the bag, is bigger. I didn't want to make mine that big, because if I made it that big, you wouldn't be able to get your fingers all the way down in the pockets to get your dice out. So I'm going to show you how I altered the pattern. As usual, I'm not giving you any of the measurements of the pattern because copyright is important, and the pattern comes with the kits, or you can get the pattern by itself if you want to make your own fabric. This fabric on the outside of this bag, though, is a digitally printed Minky that has all the different RPG dice on them. So no matter what tabletop game you play, you're probably going to play with these dice. So since this is Minky, it sort of feels like velvet. So it looks like a, sort of like an alchemy type bag, but it's got all these really pretty dice on here. Then what I did on the inside was I used some of the Wizards of the Coast licensed D&D fabric on the inside. So these are more dice here. This fabric, the little white stars, glow in the dark, because why not? The inside of the pocket, I used something light so you could see down inside the pocket. And then I just thought it would be fun to do black and white stripes. So this is the one kit that you're going to be able to get. This is the dice kit. I'm going to show you the second kit in the video today, and then we have a third kit that's just a bunch of nerdy stuff. All right, so here we go. Let's talk about how we altered Kelly's bag to be Angie's bag for all the nerds in your life. All right, so here we go. We are going to start with how we cut these circles out. This is the fabric I'm using for this bag. It is also a digitally printed Minky, so it's really fuzzy and soft, but it's got planets. And then I am using a different Wizards of the Coast licensed Dungeons and Dragons fabric on the inside. This also has dice on it. I'm going to put my fabrics right side together. It doesn't actually matter because we're not going to sew them this way. But what I found was, since this is since this is Minky and it's kind of fuzzy, if you lay it right sides together with the cotton, it doesn't shift as much. All right, so I'm going to lay that flat, and then I'm going to use a couple of pins just to hold it still on the outside out here. Now, the piece of fabric that comes in your kit, basically what comes in your kit is a bunch of fat quarters. So I'm going to put my pins around the outside of the edge so that they're not under my ruler. Okay. I'm going to fold this so that I find the middle of my fabric. Now, this fabric does have the selvage in it, so I don't want to count that as the middle because I don't want to cut into that for my circle. And then I'm just going to take a pen and I'm going to mark my center. Now, the thing that makes cutting this circle really simple is to use Karen's Quick Trim Circle Cutter ruler. This is the Quick Trim Circle ruler right there. what makes this ruler cool is you can cut any size circle you want. I know what size circle I want to cut, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my pivot point, my original pivot point in my pattern, and I'm going to put the first pivot point on my little circle that I made here. Now, if you see these bigger circles here, depending on what size circle you want to cut, this is your 0 point. You can just count by 2s to get what size you want to cut. That's great if you want a whole number. What if I want what if I want an odd number? I can take these pivot points and I can go to the middle pivot point here and I can move that to the center. So now what's going to happen is, since I'm at my 1/2 inch mark, this first circle is going to be 1. Then I can count out from the edges of my pivot point what number circle I want to have. So if this is a 1, then each circle is going to be 2. I don't know if I'm explaining that well, but that's the way that it makes sense to me. So if I start with a 1, now my first circle I'm going to add 2 is going to be 3. My second circle I'm going to add 2 is going to be 5, 7, 9, 11, 13, all the way out to the edge. Okay? If I'm going to do a whole number, depending on what size you want to cut your bag, if I put my pivot point at the even number, now I'm going to count by 2s out that circle, and that's going to be the size circle I make. Does that make sense? Does that make sense to you? I'm asking DJ.
Yes.
Okay. Well, I know that the size circle I want to cut is an odd number, so I'm going to line up the 1/2 inch there. You can use your friction pen. Since we're going to cut right on the circle, you can use a permanent pen as well. I find that my fine point permanent marker shows up really well on this. The other thing you're going to want to pay attention to is that your circle ruler can move all the way around. And see, now I've just pulled my pin out, so that's not going to work. So I'm going to put my pin in a way that it won't come out. All right, so I'm going to put my pivot point right there. And then I'm going to put my marking tool in the size circle I want to make. And I'm just going to turn this all the way around my circle here. If it gets off a little bit, just adjust it, go back. This is why we always mark this on the back side, because this is going to shift just a little bit because it is a little bit of a slippery fabric, but that's okay. It's not a big deal. That's why I'm marking my circles on the slippery fabric, so that when it comes back, my bottom fabric will be smooth. Okay, so just maneuver this however you need to get that circle marked. All the way around here. Okay, so now I have my circle made.
Look at that.
Look at that. I'm going to move my pins to the inside of my circle. And you want to have some good sharp scissors for this, because we're going to cut through both layers of our fabric. And we're going to cut right on the circle line. So that's that. So now we have the outside of our circle and the inside of our circle. We're going to put these away, and we're going to do the same thing to make our center circle. Now, this was something I added to the pattern. I'm going to cut my center circles 3 inches smaller than my outside circle. Now this is going to be the lining of my circle and the outside of my circle. So this part here, here's the outside and there's my lining. You can use whichever fabric you choose, doesn't matter to me, it's your bag. And then we're going to cut this circle 3 inches smaller than the first circle we did. So if you want to find your center, you can do that. If you like having scraps, you might want to lay this out just a little bit smoother. For the sake of speed and accuracy, we're just going to mark this. So I'm going to mark the middle of my square again. Now, like I said before, if you know what size circle you want to make, if you know it's a whole number that you're going to mark, you're going to put your pivot point in this first hole, okay? Because that's going to give you whole numbers. I'm going to mark it up to the center of my square. Use my pen, let's see. We're gonna mark it here. Now, if you don't want to waste fabric, like if it really makes you itchy to waste fabric, so here's where I'm gonna cut this one. I can turn this out to the edge over here, and I know that I have all that room over there. If I come this way and I know that I've got room over here, I can move it over here. So you can pick this up, slide it out here to the end. You can turn it this way, slide it out here to the end. What you want to make sure though is that whatever circle, whatever hole in your ruler you're going to mark, that hole stays on the fabric all the way around. Okay, so that'll help you not waste as much fabric. My pivot point, I kept my pin in the middle so I knew exactly where it was going to go. Okay, so I am going to now mark my circle. Now, hot tip, you don't have to put both of your fabrics together if they're not sticking to each other very well. You can just mark this on one fabric, and then you can put them right sides together. Because you really just need the circle on one. So I've got my circle marked. Same thing, I'm going to pin in the center of my circle, and I'm going to cut this out with scissors. All right. All right, so now we're going to make our bias binding for the top part of our bag. Whenever I'm doing this, and I'm just doing this off of a fat quarter, you don't have to have a whole big piece of fabric. This is just a fat quarter. I don't use the end with the selvage on it. I use the other end because I don't want the selvage end to end up in my bias. I'm going to take this end up here, I'm going to fold it up to the other side. Now I like to press this, because then I don't have to worry about in my cutting that it's not going to be straight. I like to have a really straight edge to start with. So we're just going to press this crisp, and then we're going to go to our cutting table and we're going to cut this. All right, so now I've got my really clean crisp edge here. I'm going to fold this up this way. So now it kind of looks like a banner. This is my favorite ruler for cutting bias binding. This is the Bias Binding Simplified Ruler by Janice Pope. It's also a Creative Grids ruler. What I like to do is take my ruler here. You'll see how on this end there's a straight line you can line up. I'm going to cut 2.5 inch strips. So if I line my little arrow line up on this side, and then I just cut along my edge, I can take this folded piece here and turn it around, and I can line the edge of my ruler up with my nice clean cut, and then that's all I waste. All right, so we only need 3 strips of bias, and I've already got 2 here. Now that I've got my clean edge, and this works great for quilts, anything you need to cut bias strips for, I didn't have to do the thing where you mark the pencil line and you sew the 2 edges and then you sit there and cut and cut and cut and cut. I can just cut my strips like this. All right, so now I can sew these end to end. I can take my bias strips here and I can sew them end to end. Since they already have this angle over here, if I flip this around, See how that works? I can just flip this over, line up my edges, and sew my 1/4 inch seam allowance. So I really dig that tool. It makes this whole process really simple. And I'm just going to make one long continuous piece of bias binding. Now I'm going to save this other bit of my fat quarter here. Now if you're not going to do the thing that, if you're not going to do this as a dice bag, you're just going to do it as a regular bag, you do need to cut a square out of this piece the size that the pattern calls for. Since I'm making mine smaller, I don't need as big of a piece. So I'm going to make my center piece about 3 inches smaller than what the pattern calls for. So I'm going to use this smaller square here, and I'm going to cut a square out. I'm also going to cut a square out, and in your kit you're going to have a piece of heavyweight fusible interfacing. So we're going to make the square the same size for this. So we're going to go ahead and cut those out, and we're going to talk about that in a second. So put this to the side. So just like when you make binding for a quilt, I have pressed my seams open and I squared off the ends of both ends of my strip here. So I want to make a finished edge. So I'm going to use my hot ruler, my hot trim or my hot pressing ruler, and I'm going to fold this over on the 1/2 inch line right here. And I'm going to press it. Okay. And I'm going to do that on both ends just to give myself a nice finished edge. Now this finished edge needs to be extra finished. So we're then going to fold it in half again. So we have a 1/4 inch finished bit here. All right. And while that's heating up, I'm going to do the other side. What I like about this ruler is I can fold it over, and then if I push the ruler snug with my fabric, I know I have exactly a 1/2 inch hem. So that gives me the 1/2 inch bit, and then if I fold it in half again, I can then have a 1/4 inch finish. Now I am going to top stitch this so that it's nice and smooth when it's done. Now you'll notice I'm only doing the 2 ends. We're going to do the other ends in a second. So I'm doing the 2 finished ends, and I'm going to cut this in half. So, and you have extra here, so don't get too weird about measuring it all out and everything. Just fold it in half and take your scissors and cut this end. All right, then, so I'm going to go and I'm going to top stitch this, and just like making binding, I'm going to fold this wrong sides together and I'm going to press it really flat. So now I have the outside of my bag, so my fuzzy one. I'm going to fold it in half. I'm going to mark the sides of my circle. Then I'm going to take my clean edge, the one that I've folded under and top stitched, and right sides together, I'm going to start pinning this in here. So I'm going to start right at the edge of where my pin is. Okay, and I'm going to start pinning this around the circle. Since this is bias, it's going to lay really easy and flat. And I pin it every, I don't know, 4 inches or so. It doesn't have to be overly pinned because you can kind of zhuzh this when you get to your machine. If you're comfortable sewing a curve, you don't even really have to pin this if you don't want to. But for the sake of those of you that will freak out by sewing a curve, I'm going to offer this tip. And do you see how I'm pinning this? I'm pinning it so that my pins are out of the way, which means I don't have to pull these out as I'm sewing them because I'm not going to sew over my pins. So we're going to go all the way around to where the other side pin is marked. Okay. Now I'm going to put a pin pretty close to where that pin is. Then I'm going to put a pin right where that pin is because I need to cut this. I need to do the hem on the other side. So if I take my ruler and I line up my 1/2 inch right there with that pin that marked the middle, now I can mark a cutting line And I can cut that extra bias off. And I can take this over to the ironing board. I'm going to take these 2 pins out because I'm going to take this back over to the ironing board, and I'm going to use my pressing tool, and I'm going to press it over and over again, and I'm going to top stitch it. Now, if you want to take all your pins out and measure this so that you know how long to cut your other one, you can, or you can just do this both times. All right, so I'm going to go finish this off, and then we're going to talk tips on sewing this. All right, so I have I finished my ends on both of my bias strips, and then I've pinned it all the way around the circle, so it kind of looks like a pie crust, right? I have switched my foot from my 1/4 inch foot to my J foot. I want to do a really narrow seam here, so I'm going to bump my needle over almost as far as it'll go and still work in my J foot, which in my machine is the right shift at the 7mm mark. I don't want to see my stitches when I put this all together, and that'll make sense in the next step. So you see how I have butted these almost right next to each other? This is going to let our drawstring work. So if I put my foot down and I start stitching this, you'll see that my seam allowance is pretty skinny, but that's okay because we're going to do a second seam allowance when we put the bag together. All right, so we're just going to go all the way around our bag here. So can you see my seam allowance is definitely smaller than a 1/4 inch? That's what we're going for. So we're just going to sew our bias all the way around our bag with a small seam allowance. And since the pins are kind of holding this in place for me, I don't have to zhuzh it very much to get the edges to line up. And since we're using a bias binding, essentially, even though it's not going to be used as a binding, this is actually the drawstring casing, it's going to just sort of fall into place, which is really nice. Alright, so I'm just going to finish sewing this, and then we'll talk about putting the lining in our bag. Alright, so I have my casing sewn all the way to the outside of my bag. I'm going to put this aside for a second. I've also sewn my 2 pocket pieces right sides together. I want to find the middle of this, and I'm just going to fold it and fold it. Since our cover piece in the center isn't that big, you're going to cut a slit to open this, but you don't want it to be super deep. So I like to give myself some parameters. I'm going to cut about a 1-inch opening here. So I'm going to mark 1 inch that way and 1 inch this way. Sometimes when you're turning circles inside out, you don't have to be that careful, but since I know that I only have this much space that I'm going to cover, I want to make sure I'm not cutting into anything that's going to be a problem later. So I've marked my 2 little lines there. I'm going to pull these away from each other, and it doesn't really matter which one you cut because you're going to cover both of them. So I've marked my line. I'm going to fold it right sides together again, or wrong sides together. See how this is separate and this is together? And I'm just going to cut on that line. I'm going to do the same thing this way, and I'm going to make kind of an X. So fold them again with your wrong sides together. Okay, so now I have this turning X, right? So since this is only 2 pieces of cotton, it's not that big a deal. You can turn it right way out pretty simply. And I know I've shown you guys this tool a bunch of times, but it's still just always going to be my favorite. Once I get this turned right way out, kind of shake it out. It's going to end up looking a little bit like a flat basketball. I'm going to use my precision turning tool, this one here, and I'm going to turn my circle all the way out. The reason I like this one is because the metal smooth balled end, you can actually push your seam out. So if you've ever tried to turn things inside out and you get them turned out and you get your corners poked and stuff, sometimes turning a circle, you don't get a smooth seam out here. But if you can push the seam out first before you press it, your circle is much smoother. All right, so I'm just going to push this all the way out with my precision turning tool. Then I'm going to close this up the best I can, and I'm going to press this really flat. All right, and then I'm going to show you what to do with it next. So I have turned my circle right way out and pressed it all flat again. So here's my opening. It's nice and flat. I've also top stitched right around the end of my circle. You don't have to do that step, but it just gives it a more finished look. Now I want to put 8 pockets in my circle. So I'm going to fold this in half, and I'm going to press it. I'm going to fold it in half, and I'm going to press it, and I'm going to fold it in half, and I'm going to press it. That's going to give me 8 wedges. I'm going to give you a tip on pressing this though, so you get really crisp edges. Now anytime you're doing this kind of work, steam is your friend. And especially anytime you're sewing on bias. Bias really likes steam because it lets everything settle back to where it was. So I'm going to fold my circle in half and press it so that I have a crisp edge. And then I'm going to fold this in half and I'm going to press it. So now I have this quarter circle. Now the reason we're pressing it and we're pressing it crisp is this gives us sewing lines. So I could fold it like that, and I could fold it like this, and I could press it again, but there's so much bulk there that you're not going to get a crisp sewing line. So what I do is I fold half this way and fold half this way and press everything with steam, because what that does is it gives me really obvious references for sewing lines, even on this black fabric. All right, so see all our pie shapes now? They're all there. So no matter which way you're going to put this up, you've pressed it. Maybe you change your mind and you want to flip it over. Your pressing lines shows you where everything's going to go. Now I'm going to take my lining fabric and I'm going to do the same thing. Since this circle is bigger, we want to have reference lines for where to line everything up and make sure that our circle is in the center. You don't have to do all 8 lines, but I usually do 2. All right, so now my lining fabric has 4 reference marks in it for me as well. All right, so I can take my circle and I might decide that I want to have this fabric up, and I might decide that I want to have this fabric up. You do whichever you prefer. Since I already have this fabric in my other sample, I'm going to line this one up instead. And you can see that my fold here lines up with that fold, and these are going to line up on this side, and this one's going to line up on this side. So now I have references. I'm going to take my ruler, any ruler, and double check and make sure that I have a consistent edge from here to here. If you don't, then move it around a little bit until you find the center of your circle. All right? So that's all pretty good. I'm going to pin this in place, and then we're going to sew right along those lines. If you feel like these lines aren't bright enough to see, you can take your friction pen and you can actually mark lines. If you feel like you want to have one big pocket and 6 small pockets, you can just not sew across here. If you only want 4 pockets, just sew twice, sew the X. I think that this is going to be a big enough pocket that you're going to be able to put a whole set of dice in there, but maybe you're the kind of person that wants to keep all of your D20s in one side. Most people keep their dice all together as a set. Maybe you're making this as a marble bag for somebody and you want to have your shooters in a bigger bag. You do whatever you want to do. Put as many lines in here as you choose. All right, so I'm going to pin out here in my pie sections, and then I'm going to sew along those edges. So now we're going to make the base of our bag. If you're doing the regular size drawstring bag, this is going to be much bigger. But I just want to have something in the center that will hold all my bag together and make my pockets possible. So I've drawn the size circle that I want on my fusible interfacing. And then I just took a scrap that was big enough that I could fit this on there and still have a 1/4 inch seam allowance, or 1/4 inch around the edge of my circle. So I'm just going to pin this in the middle, and then I'm going to sew right on my line. So I have my J-foot with my needle in the middle. And if you just sew on the line, it kind of makes it easier than doing a 1/4 inch seam allowance on a small circle. Doesn't really matter if it lines up on the edge that great, because you're just going to sew right on the line. So we're just going to go all the way around this. Now, when I get my whole circle sewn, I'm going to cut a hole in my interfacing, and I'm going to do the same thing I did before where I turned it and I poked it out with my my turning tool. Make sure that when you put this together that your fusible, the fusible side of your interfacing is on the inside. That's not life or death, but it is going to make it easier to stick it down when you're done. So I'm going to cut a hole in this and I'm going to turn it right way out, and we're going to finish putting our lining together. So since I sewed right on the line, now I can just cut my seam allowance outside of the line. I typically cut my seam allowance on these smaller circles a little bit smaller than 1/4 inch because once I turn it, I don't want to have a bunch of bulk and weird stuff around the edges. And I am going to top stitch this. So don't worry too much that you're not going to have enough extra extra seam allowance. So then I'm going to open this up, and again we're going to top stitch this so you can cut the hole kind of bigger so that you don't have to pull too hard to get it turned out. All right, so we're going to flip this out, and then we're going to use our point turner again to turn our edges or push our edges out. This is also really handy, especially when you're doing these smallish circles, because sometimes it's hard to get those seams really nice and flat. But again, what I really love about this turner is that I can kind of push really hard on the fabric and it doesn't rip through anything. It doesn't poke holes in anything, which is pretty groovy. All right, so we're going to flip this over. And again, since we sewed a circle, we're going to like some steam on there and press it really flat. Now we don't have to top stitch this one because the top stitching is going to come in the center part. Again, I'm going to use my iron to find my reference points here. And I'm going to press out my reference points on my lining because we don't actually need them anymore because now we have thread as our lineup guides. We're going to take our pressed, and of course I don't know why I used white fabric so you couldn't see it, but I did. So we're going to line these folds up with any 4 folds or any 4 seam allowance top stitching marks in our bag. So that's how you're going to know you're in the middle. Because if this point is lined up with that thread and this fold is lined up with that thread and this is lined up with that one and that's lined up with that one, then process of elimination, you are in the right place. Now you just need to top stitch around the edge of this circle and your lining is finished. Then we just have to put our bag together. So now we have the outside of our bag that has our casing on it. We have the inside of our bag that we've now added this dice pocket to. So you've got some pretty nice big pockets in there. I've top stitched my circle down, so now all of our open bits are closed and sealed up. We're just going to take this and put this right sides together. Now, you can find the middle of this if you choose to. It might be easier to know where to start. So if you fold your ends out here, put your pin marks in there. Then you can line up with the opening of the sides of your bags, side of your bag. So here's my opening between my casings. You can line the edge of my lining up right there. And again, I'm going to put my pins in a way that I don't have to pull them out as I'm sewing. If you start with your middles lined up, then everything else should just sort of go together on its own, like making a pie. All right, so I've pinned my sides, and since the hard part of this, which is the bias binding or the bias casing, has already been stitched down, you don't have to really pin it to death because the hard part's already happened. All right, so I'm just going to put a few pins in here to make it easier to maneuver in my machine. One thing you want to pay attention to, since you got nothing but layers of bias here, is you don't want to be stretching your circle as you're pinning it together. You want it to just sort of naturally lay wherever it's going to go. If you start pulling on it at all, then your side points aren't going to line up because you've distorted them. Okay, so once we get this all pinned together, all the sewing that's left to do is sew a 1/4 inch seam allowance all the way around. If you want to do a slightly wider than a 1/4 inch seam allowance, you can. So if you want to make sure that you're catching this piece underneath and you're not going to see your stay stitching that you did on in the initial pass, you can. So, you know, we all talk about a scant 1/4 inch. You can also do kind of a wide 1/4 inch. Make sure as you're sewing your edges that you leave yourself an opening point. It doesn't have to be huge. I would just do between like 2 pins here. Maybe about a 4-inch opening should be plenty. Make sure you back stitch. Don't do that. Don't leave your opening where your drawstring openings are. Okay, so we're gonna sew this round. All right, so I have back stitched at these openings. I've also done a little bit of extra back stitching at the point where my casing openings are, because that's what's going to get the most tension and tugging. All right, so once we've sewn all the way around, we're going to turn this right way out. And yet again, we're going to use our point turner. Honestly, you don't have to do that much. You can just pull on the casing and it's all going to poke out like that. I do use my point turner in this section here though, so I can get everything turned under. Now you can, if you want to, you can hand stitch this if it makes you really itchy that this is open like this. Personally, what I'm going to do is I'm going to press this down and I'm going to machine stitch this. Now you can, if you want, and it's not a bad idea, to top stitch all the way around this fold right here. That will not only close up this edge right here, but it will also make the point of your drawstring where you're going to pull on this and zhuzh it up, it'll make it even more secure. So if you want to top stitch this, and it's not a bad idea, you want to do it somewhere between the edge of the casing and that seam allowance, because then you've got all those layers of fabric that you can stitch it through. All right, so I'm going to go and top stitch that, and then we're going to put our strings in and we're going to cinch her shut. All right, so our bag's all put together. She lays pretty flat. We're going to take our cording and we're going to cut our cording length in half because we need 2. So we're just going to snip that. Then to make your knot in the end of your cording, just sort of make a loop, because this will come unraveled, and scoot your loop all the way up to the end of your cord and then pull it really tight toward you like that. Then you can snip off the parts that are coming unraveled. Okay, you can take a match to this and melt those, and that works really good too. So again, you just make a loop like you're tying a shoe, slide it up as far as you can, and then grab the knot and pull it as hard as you can pull on it. It's not going to slip off because it's going to lock it into place, and then snip off the extra bits. All right, now I really like a bodkin for this. I know I read a lot of patterns that tell you to use a safety pin. A safety pin really doesn't work for this, because if you pin that through there, the safety pin's going to unloop all of that stuff you just made. But if you take a bodkin and grip it on and slide that down, it basically turns your cording into a threaded needle. You're just going to take your bodkin and put it into one side here. Now, the thing you're going to do is you're going to put both of your sides through this one side. All right, so let me pull this through, and then I'll show you what I mean. Now we're going to pull this all the way through the whole thing. So that means you're going to come through this side and then you're going to keep on going. And when you get this all zhuzhed all the way through, you're going to tie another knot. And it starts to bunch up a little bit, but that's okay. You've got plenty of cording. So when you get back to the opening that you started at, you're going to pull this through, and you're going to take both ends of your cord and you're going to tie them to each other. Okay, so I know we already tied the little knots in there, but that's to let it be handleable. handleable, is that a word? We're going to do the same sort of knot we did to begin with in the small cord. So we're going to tie them both together and slide it up and then pull it really tight. So if you ran your cords through, if you ran your first cord through this side, and what I like to do is pull it so that it's kind of even, and then unpull it again. So you know how when you try to lace your shoes up and you end up with one end of your string that's way longer than the other one? You want your strings to be pretty much the same length so they gather the same way. So we're going to take the other cord and we're going to run it through the other side, just like we did the first one. So since this one's tied over here, this one's going to go this side. If you're making this for a kid, this is kind of a fun step for them to do.
No needles involved.
Nope. Can't stab nobody with this one. All right, so now we've got both ends run through. I'm going to tie this knot. Try to get that as even as I can. I'm going to tie this knot and zhuzh it up. All right, I'm going to show you the end result. All right, so here's our finished dice bag. This is our planet one. This is our dice one, and then we're going to have one more in the kit that has some dragons on it and some other kind of geeky stuff. So when you pull your bag shut, so you put your dice in your pockets there and you pull this shut, the whole thing pulls up like that, like a little cinch bag. And it's got lots of room in it, which is what I really dig about this. So when you open it up, you can really get down into your pockets. You've got lots of room. Once you put your dice in the little pockets, you can zhuzh it shut and put other things in there because you're going to have enough space. All right, so there you go. There is my version of Kelly bag made into a dice bag. So if you've got nerds in your life, these are going to go over, I promise. So there you go.